thank you for inviting me. I'm really, I mean, when I heard about this project not too long ago, I was really appalled because this is an area that I really care a lot about. The first time I was in Porcupine Mountain State Park was 1959 with my family. We crossed the Mackinac Bridge. It was 1 year old. It was a beautiful place. I went back a couple other times. So this is the whole region is important to me. So it's interesting that I've been working on a project to create a bunch of new national parks across the country. And one of the areas that we had been looking at already was the Western UP and the idea of a North Woods National Park. So I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about national parks in general and the proposal for a new North Woods National Park. And I also have a lot of slides, so I'm going to try to zoom through and do as good a job as you did, John. Okay, so we face a planetary emergency. You probably all know this. Climate change, biodiversity loss, impacts on people. We hear about this all the time, and then we hear solutions, but we need to reduce fossil fuel emissions. That's important, yes. But what we don't hear a lot about is the fact that one of the major solutions is to protect forests, because forests are important for carbon sequestration and storage. They cool the climate and generate rain. They're the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. And of course, we all know how important they are to people, to our health and well-being, and all the clean water, clean air, et cetera. You may have heard about the idea of 30 by 30, which is an international goal, scientific goal about protecting 30% of the planet by 2030. And there's also Half Earth, which would protect 50% of the planet by 2050. And there's international interest and support for this concept. And protected means either like a wilderness area, a national park, a national monument, most state parks, though not all, but Porcupine Mountains would fit into that category. Most of the US does not, or most of the planet doesn't meet this standard. It's only 17% of the Earth is protected under these standards. At most 13%, and that's probably overblown, of the US has this level of protection. So to get to 30%, we need at best 729 million acres of new protection in the US. Less than 2% of Michigan has this protection by my calculations. The USGS has miscalculated, thinks it's about 9%, but it's wrong. They actually are classifying all the national forests and apparently state forests in Michigan as protected, which of course we know that's not true. So I'm working with an emerging new national parks movement with people across the country who are interested in creating new parks. And as you may know, the Yellowstone was founded in 1872, more than 150 years ago. It was the first national park in the world. And it inspired almost 200 other countries, which have created thousands of new national parks around the world. And today, all these years later, Yellowstone, it goes to show the success of national parks. It's considered the largest intact ecosystem in the temperate zone by the UN. So the benefits of national parks include benefits to climate. They protect intact ecosystems, which absorb and store carbon. They also are, as I mentioned, regulate climate themselves. They cool the air, they generate rain. They are self-sustaining. They also allow for migration as climate change changes habitats. National parks are important for biodiversity because they protect large intact ecosystems. And they can protect hot spots in really important areas of rare and endangered species. Uh, we need more of them so we represent all the ecosystems in the US, which we don't now. And they have the potential to restore damaged habitats, which a lot of them in the US are right now. And new national parks are important for people because, as people have probably heard, a lot of national parks are dealing with really heavy visitation. Um, so creating new parks will help to relieve that pressure. As I mentioned, the benefits of climate mitigation obviously are beneficial to humans as well as wildlife. They benefit the local economies. Um, they they can also help to rally public support to protect the parks and also areas near them from damaging development and so forth. And one of the important things is to bring new parks to areas of the country that have little or no national park representation, including the Midwest, Northeast, South. Most major cities have no national park nearby. So this is don't pay attention to too much of the detail here, but this is to kind of give you a feeling for the various uh, benefits and liabilities of different kinds of protection. The left-hand column is national parks. Green means positive, yellow means in the middle, and red means negative. And uh, as on the right is national forests and state forests, which are basically the same in terms of management. And they pretty much don't provide much of any protection beyond you can't build Walmarts yet in a national forest. But and then you've got alternatives in between. National preserve, I'll talk a little bit about that, but it's like a national park. There are national preserves in Alaska, for example. And then you've got national lake shores, seashores, national recreation areas, which offer a lot of the same protection as a national park, but because they're recreation oriented, they can allow things that are less protective. Not always, but in some cases they do. And the same with some national monuments. Um, the reason, well, the red with state forests and national forests is they don't really do uh, recreation and education, and that's not their goal. They don't, you go to the Ottawa National Forest Visitor Center, it's closed on the weekend, I'm sure, because that's business hours. That's not their thing. And so um, in between, these other kinds of parks just don't get quite as much money to do those things. Otherwise, they would. National parks, because they're well known and they're the top of the food chain and the budgetary system, they get more money for these things. So I can answer questions on this if you want. I didn't want to overwhelm you with a bunch of data here. Okay. So most of the existing national parks are in the West and Alaska. It's hard to tell here, but these big green blobs are the big national parks. You've got Everglades. Here's the Blue Ridge Parkway. Here's Great Smoky Mountain National Park. So here's Isle Royale. Here's Voyageurs. Here's Pictured Rocks, Apostle Islands. But other than Isle Royale, Michigan doesn't have a national park. So we're proposing 100 new national parks across the country. Every state would have at least one new national park. Michigan would have or share, I think it's 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. And if you take a look, there's actually quite a bit to work with, even in the east. All these colored areas are existing federal public land. Well, most of them are federal. Here's Adirondack Park, but most of this is and then you got some state forests. So this includes large state tracts too. But if you look at the UP, there's a lot of public land to work with. So this is a rough very rough, what if map of a proposed North Woods National Park, which also would include, so it would include the Ottawa National Forest as well as the Chequamegon and Nicolet National Forests in Wisconsin. And again, this is really just a what if sort of map. And what this is doing, um, here's the light green is the Ottawa National Forest, the dark green is state forest land. Here's Porcupine Mound State Park is in yellow, and then this red is industrial lands that were purchased by, or an easement was purchased by the Nature Conservancy a number of years ago. So those are industrial forest lands. The proposal would not take any private land. It wouldn't kick people out of homes. It wouldn't include any residential areas or any towns. What it would do is a lot is turn the federal Ottawa National Forest, it would transfer it over to the National Park Service, which would give it full protection. State lands could either be just within the boundary but not included as a part of the official park. They could be, in some cases, for example, Great Smoky Mountain National Park started out as state land. Those lands were bought by the states and then transferred to the National Park Service. That's totally up to the state if they wanted, if Michigan wanted to do that. The Porcupine Mountain State Park there's no need for that to become a part of a national park. If Michiganders wanted that, that would be an option, but in reality, that's been done. I'll show you later. It would just be within the broader boundary, and what that would do is it would allow acquisition of lands around private and corporate lands that we're talking about with the mine. Those could be acquired and added to the national park, which would protect the flanks of Porcupine Mountain State Park. And the lack of protection right now for these lands, aside from the mining threat, here's the Ottawa National Forest, and a study was done in 2006 looking at roadless areas on the Ottawa National Forest. And everybody thinks, based on what the U.S. Forest Service tells us, there are hardly any roadless areas, practically nothing qualifies as wilderness. The areas that are proposed as wilderness, I think they're only saying the one area even qualifies. Even today, when I was working on wilderness back in the 1980s, same thing. They said, oh, none of these areas qualify, blah, blah, blah. They totally did not support wilderness. They still don't. But the reality is, all of these green areas. Now, this is 2006, so they probably have cut into a lot of these areas, but about 700,000 acres, around 2/3 of the forest was in some kind of roadless state at that time. So say they cut it in half, they say they reduced them by half, it still would be a huge, 300,000 acres, 350,000 acres of roadless areas still. They're not giant single areas, but if you start removing logging roads, all of a sudden you can consolidate areas into bigger and bigger roadless areas. And this is not what people often don't understand when they live near an area and enjoy it. They also don't realize how important it might be on a national scene. So this is the most carbon dense national forest in the eastern U.S. These are about the Ottawa is, and the Chequamegon and Nicolet are almost as carbon dense. So these are really important forests for storing carbon for climate change. And of course, there are existing wilderness areas, but there are also, as I say, a lot of roadless areas. This large expanse of forest is really important, as I mentioned, for weather and climate and rainfall, and keeping it intact is really important. And then you have, of course, the biodiversity of endangered and sensitive species. You've got recreational opportunities like North Country Trail. These remote areas still have dark skies where you can't find them in very many places anymore. So that in and of itself, and the quiet and peace in and of itself is a really an endangered value all across the country. And then this area is within a day's travel of about 10 million people in the Midwest. And so this has so many important values that it jumped out at us long ago as a potential national park. Um, so I won't. So I've already sort of gone into these, but again, this has protection benefits. It prohibits the specific things that national parks do. They prohibit resource extraction like logging, mining, drilling. They protect endangered species and allow their restoration. They have significant economic benefits, which I'm going to talk about. They reduce increasing parks, reduces pressure on existing parks. I noticed that Porcupine Mountain State Park got like what 600,000 visitors, I believe, recently. That's a lot of visitors for a 60,000 acre park. It's great that people are visiting the region, but you know, if you created a new national park, it would help to spread people out and give people who want to get away from crowds may just go to the Porkies for the day and then go somewhere else and camp or whatever, but it gives more options. National parks have top-notch, if you've ever been to a national park, they are the primo public education and recreation and interpretive programs. And as I mentioned, they help to generate public support for protection, and I'll talk about that. They also are flexible. Everybody thinks national parks are all like Yellowstone. It's a big square, and it's, you know, has certain strictures and that's it. But actually, there are a number of variations, which I mentioned in that chart, which I'll talk a little bit about. So this is what I was talking about. If you take a look, here's the UP. They're learning. Scientists are now learning that, as I mentioned, forests create their own weather. They create wind. They create rain. And when you reduce the forest, and that's which is everyone's heard about in the Amazon, there's a real concern that at some point you lose a critical mass of intact forest, and it literally can reduce rainfall, change the weather patterns, and so forth. So we're talking about not just local concerns, but this is part of a global concern of forest protection. And the forests in the UP, because they've been growing back, not everywhere, but a lot of them have grown back after the logging era, we're now to the point where a fair number of these forests could reach old growth, the old growth category in the not real distant future, and if we leave them alone. But if we don't, of course, we go right through the same process of starting all over again. And proforestation is a term that refers to leaving forests alone, letting them recover, letting them grow back and reach their ecological potential. So again, I won't repeat myself here, but the logging is not, it's like mining. It can be beneficial, but there are a lot of downsides. We're not anti-logging. We're not saying to ban all logging by any means, but there need to be places that are protected from logging and other intensive management, and there are hardly any places, as I mentioned, in Michigan. So national park would protect the area from logging, and that has a whole lot of benefits. It would also protect the forest from this latest craze, which is supposedly preventing and mitigating wildfire by thinning the forest and burning and so forth, which is scientifically not supported. Fire was not a major part of the ecosystem in the UP before 1600. It's an artifact of European mowing down European settlers mowing down the forests, and what was left was slash, and people were using fires and so forth. So it's not a natural process. So the prescribed burns and thinning does not mimic any kind of a natural process. It's totally something that the U.S. Forest Service and the forestry folks have sort of decided they want to do because they like to manage. Same with another management thing. I was a co-author of a paper where we looked at the whole idea where they say, oh, we need to clear forests and have openings because native wildlife don't have enough open habitats and they're declining. Well, the reality is there's more open habitat now than there was, again, in 1600. The UP was pretty much covered with old growth forests, other than water and wetlands and bogs and so forth. And there would be fires once in a real long time, or tornadoes or ice storms. But overall, it was pretty much an old growth forest. And so the species they're targeting are not in danger. None of them are in danger. There are no endangered species that need logging and thinning and clearing to survive of forests. There are none. And they just, so I've got a deer here. It's mainly driven by game managers who want more woodcock and grouse and deer. And, if they want to do that on private lands, that's their right. But why are we clearing public forests to create more habitat for species that are not in danger? It makes no sense. And then, of course, mining, which I won't get into great detail, but there's not just, of course, as I'm sure you all know, there's not just the Copperwood mine, and I'm not totally up to date on what's going on with all this, but clearly the mining industry has been in the UP for a long time and has its eyes on the UP in a lot of places to expand mining. So here's the area we're talking about as a national park. And if they have existing mining claims and rights, then you have to work through that, but no new mining would be allowed on public mining, where public mining rights existed. Where private mining rights exist, there you have a much bigger leg up to negotiate with these mining companies if you've got a national park that they want to mine in a national park. And of course, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the fact that being next to a national park makes a mine or other big development much harder in the PR circle to justify. So here you got, now it's, this mine is next to Porcupine Mountain State Park, and it's a wonderful state park, but the reality is most, people in New York City or whatever, if they've ever heard of it, that's not at the top of their scale, and they probably haven't even heard about this project. So it doesn't reach nearly as high a level in the general public's eyes. But there are examples where they do. So here's an example. Arches and Canyonlands National Park in Utah. And Utah, of course, is very conservative, and they're all for the mining industry. The legislature, all the politicians are. We're talking about Bureau of Land Management lands, which are, multiple use like a national forest, which surround Arches and Canyonlands National Park out in Utah. And they were planning to open up 80,000 acres to gas and oil drilling right within a few miles of these national parks. And they were going to do it. And all of a sudden, people around the country said, "What? Are you crazy? Drilling near national parks? No way!" And this went back and forth, and eventually it got canceled. It was like toxic. This whole issue was taught, and it still is gone today. And it doesn't look like it's going to come back anytime soon. Here's another example. Just recently, there was a proposed gold mine right near Yellowstone National Park. And these were people who had existing mineral rights. They had the legal right to do it. There were questions about the environmental impacts, of course, but they were pretty much going to be allowed to go ahead. Again, all of a sudden, people hear about the fact that there's a gold mine right outside of Yellowstone? That's crazy. And there was this national campaign. They raised millions of dollars and bought this land, and it's gone. It's done. There's no mine. Another one you may have heard of just recently, there was a proposed uranium mine near Grand Canyon National Park. So just like this mine, draining into Lake Superior, this mine would drain into the Grand Canyon. And they were moving it. They had the mineral rights, this company, it's a Canadian company. And they were going to go ahead. And again, people said, are you crazy? Mining right next to the Grand Canyon? But politically, in Arizona, northern Arizona is very conservative politically. They were all for it. They said, oh, yeah, jobs, this is great. And this thing got to be so hot that groups were proposing all kinds of solutions, including designating they were they're national forest lands, designating as a national monument. And lo and behold, President Biden just recently designated 1 million acres of land, including this proposed mine, as a national monument. So mining, that's it for mining. National parks also offer, of course, as we know, lots of recreational, economic, quality of life benefits. We know now that there are plenty of studies showing that, for example, children who have access to green, natural spaces when they grow up, they have better mental health, they have better physical health, they have a more positive attitude. It literally is good for your health to be in natural places. But just the economics, since this mining project that we're talking about says, oh yeah, jobs, benefits, national parks provide huge economic benefits to the communities nearby. And of course, these are permanent benefits. These don't go away after a few years, and they are permanent. So nationally, national parks provide about $50 billion in economic benefits each year to the region around the park. 378,000 jobs, 312 million people visited the national parks last year. And that's about what it's been in recent years. So almost, in effect, it's almost like every person in the US visits a national park each year. Some people obviously go more than once. But the reality is national parks are universal. Everybody knows about national parks. Everybody's been to a national park at some point, probably. So here's an example. I picked Canyonlands because that's in Utah, which I just mentioned. If you've ever been there, it's way out. It's not on the way to anything. It's in the boonies. It's beautiful. It's wonderful, but it's not nearby. It's even Salt Lake City is quite a drive from there. Yet here in 2022, $124 million in benefits to the local communities. Moab, Utah is the closest town, and they have had huge economic benefits from this park. 1,320 jobs, permanent jobs, and they got 779,000 visitors last year. Now you were talking about Porcupine Mountain's getting about 600,000. So say a national park could boost the number of visitors to the region. It's not going to, it would not double the number because a lot of people would go to Porcupine Mountains anyway. But what it would probably do is make it more of a destination for people farther away. And people would, instead of spending all their time in the Porkies, as beautiful as they are, if they wanted to, they would have a lot of other options. Now, another thing is, and again, talking about the state park, this looks complicated, but the point is, national parks are not all like one big square federal owned blob like Yellowstone. They can have all kinds of configurations. Here's Redwood National Park in California. And in fact, Redwood National Park is actually Redwood National and State Parks. And Redwood surrounds 3 state parks. And the state parks are still state parks. They're totally managed by the state. The land is state land, but they cooperatively manage these lands. And the benefit of that has been that federal money has helped in planning and in facilities and in programs, and working together has been really beneficial. And also the national park fills in lands adjacent to these state parks, which were originally separate blobs. and has bought and has acquired federally acquired land that's protect the periphery of these parks. So this would be the same kind of thing that could be done with Porcupine Mountain State Park, for example. Another thing is, of course, just knowing Michigan is a big hunting state, and so you have to address that issue. A lot of people want to hunt, and that's a part of the tradition. Well, national parks do not allow hunting. That's something that goes way back to Yellowstone, and the reason was because they were trying to protect intact ecosystems with minimal human interference. And fishing is allowed because it was seen as less intrusive back in the day, although it can be damaging with in and of itself. But and we're not pro or anti hunting or fishing. But the reality is national parks uh, are going to not have hunting, and I think that's a good thing. On the other hand, national park and preserve can allow hunting, and so you may
Right.
not. Most people don't realize, but uh, national preserves are
Mm,
just like national parks, except they can allow other uses. And so here's Wrangell St. Elias National Park in Alaska, and it's a little hard to see here, but the sort of olive green is the national, I'll get it the opposite here, national park area, right? I'm having trouble reading that. It, I think the dark green is a national preserve, and the light green is national. No, it's the opposite. Okay, light green is national preserve, dark green is national park, and what that is they picked the areas that were really important for hunting, and they're basically zoned. It's a zone within the national park, and it's so you can do sport hunting just like you could in, say, the Ottawa National Forest, but then there are other areas in a national park. The advantage of this is uh, nobody knows what a national preserve is. If you ask anybody, can you name a national preserve? Nobody can name a national preserve, even though there are a number of them. Uh, Yukon Charlie National Preserve in Alaska, for example. Everybody can name a national park. National parks are destinations. If you don't have a portion of an area national park, you're really missing out on a huge potential on all the fronts that I mentioned. So what we would see is some kind of a combination of park and preserve, probably for a North Woods National Park. So how are national parks created? They're either the Congress passes legislation to designate them. That's how Isle Royale was created. But also the national monuments can be under the National Park Service, and the president can designate them under the Antiquities Act. So are national parks feasible? Politically, is it even possible now? I mentioned some of the things, but the reality is, uh, this moved a little bit here, but oops, sorry. The Pew Research Center does surveys asking people for their favorability toward various agencies. National Park Service was #1 this last time. It was #2 under the Postal Service before that, and the two go back and forth. So even today, national parks are really popular. And one example is this bottle. The reason I have that is that I was on a flight from Munich, Germany. This is the bottle they gave us with water, and it's national park water, unspoiled, water, and it's from Germany. But national parks have this image of purity and cleanliness and greenness. It's just a universal image. So a couple of quick examples and I'll finish here. The recent examples of national park areas, here's a national monument that President Obama designated in Maine. Northern Maine, if you don't know Maine, it's a lot like the UP. It's politically, demographically very similar in a lot of ways, other than not having much public land, but it's got large timberlands. This area already had 0 visitors in 2015 because it wasn't a national monument, it was private donated land. Today it's gotten about 43,000 visitors, and this is way northern Maine in the boonies. Indiana Dunes, you probably know, got upgraded, changed to a national park. Its visitation went up from 1.7 million to 2.8 million after the designation, and it's providing lots of economic benefits. New River Gorge in West Virginia, which is another area that's very conservative, very red state, yet there was political support to upgrade this area to a national park. It includes a preserve area for hunting, and it's already providing lots of economic local benefits. So we're working on a new national parks campaign. I won't go into all the details of it. I'd be happy to answer questions. But what we're doing is developing park proposals with ourselves and with other groups around the country. We're starting a new website pretty soon, newparks.org. We're building a coalition of organizations who want to work toward this. And we've got a whole campaign to make this a national issue and create a whole bunch of new parks with a whole coalition of groups around the country. So that's it. If you're interested, we have a website. You can get more information. I'd be happy to talk to people if you want to email me. And thanks for the opportunity to share.